Hi, folks. My name is Rob Eiler. I have a business called Economic Forensics and Analytics, and I provided the data for the SEDS report and some of the forecasting. What we want to do tonight is I want to show you some of the forecasting data that we used and also some of the latest updates about the American economy and things to watch for when you're reading the SEDS document and thinking, in what context is the American economy going to leave Lake County in terms of what to do with the SEDS report and some of the projects within and some of the things that will just simply come up in Lake County's economy over the next few years. So let's start with looking at the latest forecast where we're using what's called the Survey of Professional Forecasters from the Philadelphia Federal Reserve. So every quarter, the economists at the Philadelphia Federal Reserve interview 40 economists around the United States that all those folks do is forecast what's going on in the American economy. And three of the variables that they look at, I pulled out of that forecast to kind of show, in my mind, the way you should be thinking about major variables that might affect Lake County over the next few years. The first one is real GDP growth, or the change in income on an annualized basis after inflation that the American economy generates. So that these data are from August 2024, and the latest quarter's forecast is to see a little bit of a bump in the growth this year and about the same next year and a little bit more in 2026. So you should be comparing that column called previous just to that shaded column's left. And you can see that the 2 quarters ago, which is the previous quarter, it was 2.5% growth for this year, and now it's 2.6. But I'll come back to why it's such a small change and what might be really driving that change. Not necessarily more income growth, but actually a little bit less inflation. And you can see that progression over the next few years. If you look at the unemployment rate, which is our second variable, really, really good numbers. But again, comparing to the previous quarter's forecast to think about whether or not these forecasters become a little bit more optimistic or pessimistic, they've become a little bit more pessimistic about the labor market, which makes sense. We've seen unemployment creep up a little bit in the United States faster than we expected, a little bit more in California than we expected, but not too fast and not too high a number after 2027. So think of this as where unemployment is going to be at the end of the year, the current forecast for that number. And you can see a lot, not really much more than 4%, maybe creeping up on 4.5%, but those are still very historic, robust numbers. So that's all good in terms of the labor market as long as those things hold. If you look at what's called core PCE inflation, or what in more expanded terms is called core personal consumption expenditures price inflation, those numbers are slowly fading toward 2026. We don't really look more than 3 years out for inflation. And generally speaking, an economic forecast, 3 years or more is really reaching around in the dark. But you can see that number's fading. Not much change from the previous quarter, but it is fading a little faster. And the key here is that we want to see it move toward 2, which suggests that the Federal Reserve is going to be lowering interest rates as long as inflation is moving toward that 2% outcome by the end of 2026 and keeps progressing in that direction. Rates should follow. So the reason why that's important is if we think about the financial market context in which Lake County businesses, Lake County consumers, regional businesses and consumers, and thinking more about borrowing to get infrastructure done or to pay for new apartments or new houses or new cars across businesses and consumers, rates falling are going to provide some relief, and we should expect them to fall. So this forecast is really suggesting there's no recession, even though the probability is about 15% of seeing a recession between, let's say, 2025 and 2026. We should also expect job losses are coming, but very slow movement. And as long as the Federal Reserve lowers rates at a very predicted speed, we should not expect a lot of financial market volatility that would undermine some of these changes in some of the growth. So that's a good forecast. However, I wanted to leave you at the national level with these ideas. If we're actually going to have continued growth, these are kind of the characteristics we're going to need. So when you're thinking about Lake County and what the SED says we should be doing in Lake County, if these things hold, that should provide the right national economic context for Lake County to move forward with the SEDS well and really have a more robust economy toward 2030. And not having this sort of interference pattern from the national economy undermining growth locally. So labor market gains kind of continue. You should expect some job losses, but generally speaking, labor markets hold pretty steady, which that forecast we just saw suggests they will. Steady inflation, same thing that's forecasted for that outcome. Equity market strength, we don't want to have a total bloodletting in our equity markets. We've seen a little bit of this in the beginning of August. It's somewhat recovered, but we don't like volatility in equity markets because it just makes businesses pause about where the economy is going. Interest rate stability, as interest rates fall and kind of remain relatively predictable, that will help. And then global conflicts and global geopolitics remaining relatively stable will help also. A higher probability of recession happening will happen if, in fact, we have these outcomes. So if we have rising credit delinquencies, if more people stop paying their credit card bills, stop paying for their cars and have them repossessed, maybe end up defaulting on their home loan. We don't want to see that, but we're also seeing relatively low savings rates. So we want to see the savings rate pick up and we want to see delinquencies flatten out. But both of those are currently going in the wrong direction, which is acting as some headwind on those growth forecasts we just saw before. We know that inflation, even though it's falling, has a continued pinch, especially on low to middle income homes. So that compounding effect is starting to have a larger effect on households and ultimately the way we think about buying things like cars, furniture, appliances, and what we think of as consumer durables. And it also makes businesses pause what consumer demand will be, not now, but 18 or 24 months from now. When we look at manufacturing, we've seen a little bit more pessimism and a little slower growth of what we think of as manufacturing new orders, which usually is a leading indicator of where the economy is going. So that suggests we might also see a slowdown in jobs, and we're already starting to see some of that. Again, those political issues, if we see a flare-up either domestically or internationally, we just got to basically get to November 5 in so many ways to feel like that what we've got, at least at home, is now known, regardless of what part of the political spectrum you're on. Having that uncertainty can undermine business outcomes, and this is certainly true of global conflicts. If we look at the jobs forecast for California and Lake County, just to contrast these initially, and then we're going to add some other comparisons in just a second. Lake County's original pop out of the pandemic time has flattened out a little bit. So these data are annualized total number of people working at a Lake County or California-based employer from 2010 forward. And the shaded area is the current forecast for these areas. And you can see there's the black line, which is Lake County. There was that nice pop growing faster for a little while than the state in a lot of places around the state, but then slowing down and is now kind of flattened out as we've entered the middle portion and later portion of 2024. But we do expect that to grow. And some of that growth will be how the SEDS and the tasks and the strategic planning inside get executed and how Lake County's economy are able to build on what those things are going to be and what, in essence, Lake County's tomorrow is going to look like. So we want to see that growth. And we're going to see in a minute what industries that those are based on. But this is what Humboldt's forecast looks like. So Humboldt's a lot flatter than Lake County. Mendocino, very similar. And if you start thinking about sort of northern rural California, the forecast is becoming a little bit trickier in terms of growth for coastal California in the northern portion. So thinking Humboldt, Mendocino, Del Norte, Trinity counties. Lake County looks like it's breaking away a little bit from that, but having kind of similar aspects, at least in the short term, a lot of that based on construction slowing down and the population change sort of flattening out and defining itself with a little bit older population. Sonoma and Napa sort of moving in the same directions and having a little bit more growth than those smaller rural areas, where Napa's really kind of stood out in terms of the recent growth we've seen in Napa County. Lake County can feed off of some of that growth in Napa County, and the SEDS describes Napa's role to a certain extent in the regional context and how it affects Lake County. But all these places growing a little bit more slowly than the state, which is the green line we saw right off the top. So generally speaking, toward 2030, the jobs forecast, which is a blend of what Caltrans is doing for its transportation planning, my own thoughts about which direction these counties are going, and the California Department of Finance looking forward for the state economy and for the county economies over time, that this is where we're at right now, where California overall is going to grow a little faster than, let's say, the Lake County region. So some things to think about. That growth pattern toward 2030 is about 7% growth from 2023. So to a certain extent, it doesn't really rely on cannabis because you're not really counting cannabis jobs yet, unfortunately. And the shift in industries we're going to see in a minute is really more toward healthcare and services, unfortunately, versus construction manufacturing. But Lake County does have in its forecast a little bit of growth, in construction and a little bit more in manufacturing. Some of that will be ag-based. You think in your mind it's got to be also cannabis-based in some ways. But part of defining an economy is the industry mix within it. And that's a big deal when you start thinking about economic development planning is, A, what industries are really going to survive and thrive in a county based on its regional context and also what's happening within the county? And then how realistic is this forecast given a lot of the changes and given maybe what changes are to come, in the sense that if this is seen as the status quo, can a better economic development path exceed this growth pattern and get Lake County even better off by 2030? If we look at the industry level, this is what the forecast looks like in Lake moving toward 2030 from 2023. So a lot of growth in transportation, logistics, and utilities, sort of slow walk up the ladder of more jobs in logistics because of home delivery and just all of us sort of ordering stuff that both businesses and consumers want to have come home. Farm, which you can see at negative 5.8 on the left-hand side, is a little disturbing in the sense that you're thinking in your mind, well, how is that possible? It doesn't count cannabis yet, but we probably will see more mechanization in agriculture and perhaps, unfortunately, a little bit more of a contraction in family farms just simply through generational change, if nothing else. And if you move toward the right, that info and tech is a really small portion of Lake County, but is wherever technology is in Lake County, that's where that lies, thinking software as well. And then health and private education dominated by health. Healthcare is going to continue to rise in Lake County as a growth industry. And then from an economic development standpoint, it's intelligent to ask, is that good or bad? And so that's kind of the things we want to do looking at California in contrast. California's got a little bit more growth in the black columns, especially in leisure and hospitality. But a lot of that depends on how people come back to California and also think about Lake County as a place to travel. And this kind of generates the idea that California will grow a little faster than Lake County. But we got to think, what are we seeing in Lake County that would support this forecast? Do we have the right worker mix? Do we have the right support industries? Will healthcare growing have a positive or sort of maybe mixed negative effect because it's really kind of this magnet that pulls workers toward it and eliminates other possibilities? But if it's not there, that's a big problem for what you can think of as a quality of life issue in Lake County. So we want a robust healthcare system everywhere. Lake County needs to really hold on to that and watch it grow. And that, unfortunately, might also be a harbinger of an aging population, which has its own issues in terms of workforce availability and demand for goods and services at different vendors. But these are things that will need to be shaped over time in terms of watching the economy change. If we look at the housing forecast, this forecast suggests that Lake County is going to see a little bit of a slip in price. And you can see, coming back to the same thing we saw with the growth forecasts, Humboldt, Lake, Trinity, Mendocino, as of July 2024, have the most negative forecast. We want to see it that way, the most pessimistic forecast among the counties in the state of California right now, at least according to Zillow's research team. But the good thing about this is it's not a very quick downturn in terms of a big number. California is meant to grow about 0.4%, which is not that big a deal. In terms of basically means that supply and demand are going to be equal and there's not much growth at all. For Lake County, I think we're having a little bit of sifting in terms of people who originally moved to Lake County during the pandemic are now thinking about the long term. And then that really feeds into the entire idea around the SEDS. Will Lake County's evolution from an economic development standpoint provide a way of stabilizing home prices, stabilizing the population, and generating a workforce that then wants to work in Lake County and get that GDP growth, or what you think of the gross regional product in Lake County rising, and get those household incomes up? All those kind of feed off of each other in this, what you think of as virtuous cycle when things are working correctly. And that's really the idea behind the SEDS. And these forecast numbers simply provide the context for that outcome. Thank you so much.